Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 1.3 in our development unit, which will talk about theories and models of development. So by the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain 4 different models and or theories that pertain to development. You should be able to explain the modernization theory, dependency theory, neoliberalism, and the Washington Consensus. So our first development theory that we're going to talk about today is the idea of the modernization theory. And modernization theory states that there is only one single way for countries to modernize and to develop, and that is to imitate what old industrialized nations did. You have to replicate what the United States, Britain, and Germany did through the Industrial Revolution. That's what modernization theory is. It is the oldest theory of development, and it is one that is most traditional in geopolitical theoretical discussions. Now, Walt Whitman Rostow is the best known modern theorist in geopolitical theory discussions. And Rostow actually came up with his own idea behind modernization development, and it was the 5 stages of development, which are located right here in this graphic. And so basically, in a nutshell, it starts here with, a traditional society where, it's based on subsistence farming, fishing, forestry, and some mining. So we're talking, kind of primitive type of societies. And then it just moves up the ladder. And if you can pause the video, you can actually stop for a moment to see which the different stages are. But these are stages of growth. So a group, a society, a country will go from the traditional society and eventually move their way up to high consumption. And so governments would build infrastructure, create businesses with government subsidies, and develop new trade deals. This is all the things that will be happening once we get to high consumption. The government is able to build infrastructure, create businesses, because the government's able to give out loans. That is what subsidies are, and also to develop new trade deals. This is going to lead to something that is known as city bias in some countries, making farm products cheaper for cities. And so the idea is that, farms are existing to serve the idea and needs of cities, and that farmers provide food cheaply for cities, but cities then make living expenses for farmers actually much more difficult. So this whole idea of city bias comes out of the idea of modernization theory. So the next theory of development we're going to talk about is dependency theory, which is also known as world systems theory. So if you're seeing a document that mentions this, these are both the same thing. Dependency theory and world systems theory are the same. So first of all, dependency theory is based on ideas behind Marxism, and dependency theory really became very popular in the 1960s and 70s, and it is a direct contradiction and critique, if you will, of modernization theory. And here's why. Dependency theory states first that underdeveloped nations are locked into an unfair system of trade dominated by rich nations. First and foremost, that should tell you right there that we are in direct contradiction to what the previous slide had to say about modernization theory. Secondly, the world is divided between a center, which is the former colonial powers, and the periphery, which are the newly independent poor. Okay, so our world is now divided into 2 different zones, if you will, the center and the periphery. The center is the old colonial powers, the periphery is the newly independent poorer nations. The center gets rich by exploiting the poor and has interest in maintaining this to keep getting rich. And so the idea is that these former colonial powers are doing everything they can to keep these poorer countries poorer because it helps them maintain their rich lifestyle. It's hard for nations to catch up when Western nations developed through colonization. And so what this means is that the Western nations that are now in turn basically that have now freed these other nations, the idea is how can these poorer nations ever catch up if the richer nations actually benefit off the idea of colonization? And so that means that the poorer nations must stay poor in order for the richer nations to stay rich. And so it's cyclical. And so the West has a vested system in keeping this whole dependency theory going. And so this is a total direct opposite viewpoint from modernization theory, but it gives you an idea of how the process is evolving into changing into a different mindset. So when you take a look at dependency theory in action, what do we mean when we talk about dependency theory? What does it look like? So when a former colonial power would free an independent nation, this new independent nation's government would typically do the following things. It would institute high tariffs on imports to protect their own industries. This makes sense. You just were freed and are independent. You're trying to get your industry to get built. So you're trying to encourage people to buy your products. So you're trying to encourage the people of your country to buy your products. So you put high tariffs on imports. They overvalue their currencies to make production cheaper. So they're doing everything they can to make production cheaper, and one of the ways they feel to do that is to overvalue their currencies. And which happens if you start manipulating numbers like that in the market, and then something happens within the market where it goes down or goes up. I mean, the overvaluation of your currency can have a negative impact, or eventually will have a negative impact on everything that you do. These new governments will subsidize agriculture and industry to sustain self sufficiency because they're newly independent, so they're going to do everything they can to try to make their own industries work without foreign influence. And so that costs money. So the consequences of this whole idea of these new countries trying to become self sufficient are the following: it leads to governments having to borrow money. So these poor these new countries that are poor and that have just become independent, they're trying to do all of these things here, so they're going to have to borrow money to do it. Then it leads to corruption as the new government begin to regulate the economy, because then as things start to fall apart, this new government starts to regulate. And this leads to corruption. And this led to Western powers creating something called the IFI, or the International Financial Institutions, to pressure developing nations into changing their systems of government. So now these poor countries are constant pressure to accept democracy, and oftentimes these come at costs with other countries, predominantly Western countries, paying the bill or making the request or trying to heavily influence this country politically. So our next development theory that we're going to talk about is the theory of neoliberalism. And the idea of neoliberalism actually really became very popular in the 1980s throughout the world. And so what neoliberalism talks about is the idea of the whole concept of the free market, which is basically capitalism. So the free market is the best and most fair and efficient way to foster economic growth and development. So if you're a neoliberalist, you believe that, keeping the world in a capitalist system, so keeping capitalist system in place is the most fair and efficient way to foster economic growth and development throughout the world. So neoliberals believe that government intervention into the economy causes problems. So the government that intervenes least is the best type of government. They believe that government intervention leads to corruption, and oftentimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. So it just depends on the type of government that the people have, but oftentimes they're true that it does lead to corruption, but many times it doesn't. Neoliberals also believe that government intervention would allow the strongest companies to survive, and in turn will allow for sustainable development. So basically, if you're a company and you open up, if you're not strong enough to survive, then you are not strong enough to provide sustainable development for the country. So, for example, these companies that have been around, like Walmart, that's a very sustainable company because everybody goes there, regardless if you like it or regardless if how we feel about how Walmart treats its workers, et cetera, et cetera. We still shop there. And so it's a sustainable company. And so as a result, it's put out a lot of smaller companies or smaller mom and pop organizations because people just wouldn't go to those. They would go to Walmart. And the government doesn't come in and try to save these smaller companies because they want the larger companies to thrive, because they in turn provide jobs for the people. They provide income for cities and taxes for cities and counties and states and in federal government, federal taxes and things like that. So the government has not intervened, and as a result, it's allowing more and more companies to become corporations to be able to sustain workers and things like that. Likewise, the government should reduce its social services. So, neoliberals believe that the government should stop spending money on Social Security and health care and education because it would encourage people to contribute on their own. And so, in a perfect world, if we have these companies getting better and better and richer, then eventually companies like Amazon and all these larger companies will develop their own systems of Social Security to take care of their workers, and their own systems of healthcare to take care of their workers, and then also their own system of education and the own system of building roads. That's really the ultimate goal. So neoliberals in this graphic want to reduce the debt and have free trade. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan are definitely two individuals that are most known for modern neoliberalism. So, what are some of the criticisms of neoliberalism? Well, first of all, the cost of reducing government services became the responsibility of charities and NGOs. NGOs are non government organizations. And so, if the government is no longer providing social services, and healthcare and things like that, well, then that means other private entities are going to have to step up, or other charity organizations will do that. This led to the idea of privatization, and you do need to know what privatization is, in privatization of many industries. So that's where you see education and healthcare. So those of you that went to things like charter schools, even though that wasn't private school, that was this is part of that idea of neoliberalism of taking the state out of it. So that's why many charter schools have reduced state requirements, because there's this idea steeped in neoliberalism that started out in that movement. But you started seeing more and more private schools and more private healthcare facilities popping up in the 80s and 90s into the early 2000s. Neoliberalism also continues to contend that competition between social welfare providers leads to less corruption and more efficient use of resources. So, if you take the government out of the healthcare industry and out of education and let schools duke it out and become competitive, then that's more efficient and more fair, and it leads to less corruption, according to neoliberals. But this whole idea leads to the concept of something called trickle-down economics, which you probably heard throughout the 1980s, especially under Ronald Reagan. And the idea of trickle-down economics is that the rich get richer, and they spend the money. And so this helps industries that employ more people to make consumers the goods that they need. So as people get richer and richer, they will actually spend more and more money. And so if you spend more and more money, then that will cause, so for example, if this is you, and then you spend money at this particular company, it will cause this company to then in turn invest in its workers, which will make more stuff so that you will come back and buy. And so that's the whole idea, that they're trying to think that trickle-down economics will work, but we know that this simply does not work. So one of the consequences of neoliberalism is the creation of something called structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. Now, SAPs were negotiated among the IFIs, and among the two most prominent ones were the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And so the IMF and the World Bank would come together and create these structural adjustment programs along with the governments of underdeveloped and indebted nations. So these poor nations that had just been freed from colonial powers have been, throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, spinning their wheels and going through regime changes and going through these, and it's not getting any better. So now they're stuck. And so now these richer countries are creating, the IMF and the World Bank is creating SAPs, or structural adjustment programs, with these poor countries. What do these structural adjustment programs entail? They require them to lower trade tariffs. So that now means that their local goods are now on equal footing with foreign goods. So on the equal footing with foreign goods. They want them to cut public spending. So this government now is going to have to cut spending from its healthcare, its education, and all of that, because this structural adjustment program, the IMF and the World Bank is giving them a loan, Well, one of the stipulations of that loan is that you have to cut back your social program spending. And so that means that there's going to be no money coming into schools and healthcare and that type of thing. They also will require privatization of public services, so they will require them to open up healthcare and education to private schools. So that means companies and corporations can actually go in there and then take control of healthcare and education. Now, here's a graphic that's kind of showing a little bit about what this kind of thing is entailing. If you look back in the old days, I claimed this land in the name of His Majesty, and then the IMF comes to claim this newly freed country. I structurally adjust this land in the name of economic growth. So take this information for what you wish. And lastly, the last development theory we're going to talk about is the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus came out around in the 1990s. And so what it emphasized was a stronger message on the free market non-interventionism, strong institutions, and good policies. So basically this is neoliberalism light. Okay, so this is neoliberalism light. So they're taking some of the negative consequences of that neoliberalism and trying to strike a balance, if you will, between the negative effects of neoliberalism and complete deregulation. So for those people that are saying we need to go all the way over here and deregulate, not have the government be involved in anything, they say that's not correct, this Washington Consensus. But they also believe that there should be some government intervention when it benefits, the government, the people, whatever the case may be. But they're trying to strike that balance is what this is trying to achieve, this Washington Consensus. And it has influenced global development throughout the later part of the 20th century and emerging into the early parts of the 21st century. And how that's happened is the Washington Consensus has helped develop things like the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Development Plan, and the programs that are developed through the World Bank. All of those things are coming out of this movement from the Washington Consensus, which is trying to strike a balance between neoliberalism and an emerging globalization effort that's coming out throughout the 21st century. And this graphic here is showing you a lot about that change. Back in the 1990s, you had the IMF and the World Bank telling people you need to reform. And now basically the global community is looking back at the World Bank and the IMF and saying, no, you need to reform. So that is the end of our lesson 1.3, theories and models of development. So can you explain 4 different models and or theories of development, such as modernization theory, dependency theory, neoliberalism, and Washington Consensus? If you can, pat yourself on the back. You're an amazing person. You have completed 1.3 and you know everything that's needed in here. So at this point, complete any activities that are attached to 1.3, and then you want to make sure you check in to take a proficiency check. You are going to take a proficiency check on lessons 1.1 through 1.3, and you will take that proficiency check. Once you have achieved mastery or, proficiency of that, then you will move on to lesson 1.4. Again, thank you so much for your time. Have a great afternoon.